Researchers say because of their exposure to leaded petrol, Kiwi kids growing up in the 1970s and 80s now have lower IQs as adults. Lobby groups are being blamed for delays in switching to unleaded, which has us asking, what influence do they still have?
They say lead in drinking water made Beethoven mad and deaf. Despite probable poisoning, he still produced masterpieces. Unfortunately, for a generation of Kiwi kids, the results were not so grand. The Dunedin longitudinal study has concluded that pollution from leaded petrol made the children of the 70s and 80s dumber. About half the children tested for lead suffered a 4.25 point drop in their IQ by adulthood.
What we did find is that there's very slight but detectable difference at age 38, and what's interesting about it is that it has lasted so long.
The dangers of lead were long known. Japan and other countries banned leaded fuel in the 80s. But New Zealand waited until 1996 as successive governments ignored the science here and abroad. The petroleum lobby challenged the ban, claiming that it would cost consumers.
The oil companies were very hard to pin down.
But the Dunedin study's findings have for the first time made clear when public policy falls short, society foots a much bigger bill in the long run.
My husband, who was doing blood lead level testing in the 70s and 80s, used to get so frustrated that so little was happening as the evidence mounted.
So is the real danger that lobby groups pressure governments and delay the big calls. And is this still happening?
Well, public health expert Professor Nick Wilson joins us now. So these lobby groups had such a huge amount of influence then. How were they able to pull off telling the government what to do?
Well, they bring in overseas experts and they provide reports, and they meet with officials and politicians, and that was the pattern that was happening in the 1970s and 80s, and also right up to the last point, 1996, when lead was finally banned in New Zealand petrol. So it was a very active process, and it really led to long delays.
Interestingly, Nick, I spoke to one of the co-authors of the study today on RNZ, and she said to me we shouldn't be too hard on the government, that actually waiting for evidence and moving cautiously is what governments should do. What do you say to that?
Well, I think on many issues that is true, but when you're dealing with children's intelligence and you're dealing with a neurotoxin, you really have to prioritise the well-being of children. And so you should take a precautionary approach so that even if all the evidence is not in, governments need to act. And in this case, we already had examples of countries like Japan that by the early 1980s had virtually completely removed lead from their petrol.
Nick, it was petrol in the 70s and 80s. What's the equivalent today?
Well, public health people are arguing for a range of issues, and one of the big ones is the obesity problem, and so there's a lot of suggestions that we should be adopting a tax on sugary drinks, but the food industry in New Zealand is completely against that, and they lobby government to prevent that happening. And they're successful lobbyists. They prevented the introduction of folate into bread in New Zealand, even though that's standard practice in many other countries. So we're seeing this corporate power still having a bigger influence than the voice of science and the voice of health researchers.
Nick Wilson, thanks so much for your time tonight. Really appreciate it.
Very good. Thanks a lot.
So Nick said it, all right. It's all very well criticising the government of the 80s and the 90s and saying they took too long, but the same thing, exact same thing's happening right now with sugar. So if you want to do something about it, put some pressure on to do something about sugar.
Yeah, I think we as citizens actually have to take action, because big business is there for a reason. It's there to sell product. So you kind of can't blame them, but you can't be blind about it either. If they're going to make business selling stuff that's harming our children and the health and well-being of them in the future, take some action.
Totally.
All right, wow. Thanks, unleaded Petra. Now